Right.
Yeah.
Just check you got that. Okay. Hello, and welcome to another Whisky Me live tasting. I'm Tristan Stevenson, co-founder of Whisky Me, and this is
Thomas Ask,
co-founder of Whisky Me.
Exactly.
Super happy to have Tom with us tonight, who you may recognise from TV's Dragon's Den, amongst other appearances.
Crime Watch.
We're actually broadcasting from one of our bars here in East London, which fortunately is reasonably quiet tonight, although you may hear some background noise, so apologies for that in advance. We're just waiting for a few more people to fill into the room. We've got a couple of great guests tonight, which means we're going to have four of us talking about and drinking whiskey, along with hopefully dozens of you guys as well. So you're very welcome to join us. If it's your first time, please sit back, relax, enjoy yourself. Feel free to ask any questions. Nothing is off limits. Well, please sort of keep it vaguely related to whiskey and not sort of stuff that might incriminate us. And your tasting notes are very welcome too, and all that. So we're going to kick off the tasting with Tomatin 12, which is our Scotch whiskey of the month. And to do that, we are going to bring in Scott Adamson, who is... Hello, Scott.
Hey, guys.
You are Tomatin ambassador and blender, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for coming on. So one of the first questions that we had, because it's
how do you bloody pronounce it?
Yeah. How do you pronounce Tomatin?
It's like Tomatin, Tomatin.
You were close there, Tom. It's Tomatin. So we often say it's smooth like satin. Tomatin.
Yeah. So you start the word as if you're saying tomato, and then at the last minute you go in instead of
Yeah, we just throw a curveball in there. Yeah.
I have to be honest, I looked at about 4 different videos of people pronouncing it, and I was like, all of these are different. I can't quite work out who is legitimate and who isn't. So that's good to clear that one up at least.
After a few of them, I get it wrong myself sometimes. You know, I start calling it the 12-year-old at that point.
I swear, though, I think I'm mispronouncing most of the distilleries in Scotland. It's just that I think the first sort of way in which you pronounce it is the one that tends to stick, and it's really difficult to budge that after a while, you know.
But at least you're consistent. That's the main thing.
Oh, yeah. There's no consistently wrong. I can definitely say that. Yeah. So maybe you can start with a little bit of a history about Tomatin.
Yeah, you nailed it there. You've got it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Tomatin, funnily enough, on the 8th of June this year, we'll be celebrating our 125th anniversary. So there's a good bit of history there, but I'll try and keep it light at the moment. My background is in history. I studied Scottish history, so I can go off on tangents here. But the distillery is one of the 1890s gang. It was one of those 40 or so distilleries built in the last decade of the 19th century. But in the 1890s, Tomatin wasn't the typical place to build a distillery. If you look at the Highlands of Scotland at that time, all of the distilleries are coastal because the sea was very much the highway. But what was going on was the Highland Railway line was being constructed that would connect Inverness to Aviemore and from Aviemore to Edinburgh and the rest of the world. And it was being built right through Tomatin. So Tomatin sits 15 or so miles to the south of Inverness. It's 315 meters above sea level, a pretty inaccessible, inhospitable place right up until 1897. But with the railway line, a local guy called John McDougall decided that this was the perfect opportunity to build a distillery. John was one of these kind of Victorian improvers. He was born and raised in Tomatin. He was the merchant, the schoolmaster, the postmaster, the registrar, the local factor. And so the railway line gave him an opportunity to bring industry to the area. And he built the Tomatin Spey District Distillery Company. And unfortunately, it wasn't very successful. After just 9 years in 1906, they were bankrupt. But I think what John's legacy is that as well as building a distillery, he built this incredible community there. He recognized that the local population were not distillers, certainly not legally. So he built a handful of cottages and attracted a workforce to the area. And as the distillery would go on to expand, so did the number of cottages. So today we still have 30 cottages on site. We're the last distillery in Scotland to provide housing to the majority of our workforce. So more than half the people that make the whiskey actually live on site. So fortunately, a few years later, the distillery was saved by a couple of wine merchants from London. They were called the Callinghams and the Saunders, and they were whiskey blenders in their own right, but they also bought a lot of wine and rums from around the world and used those casks. They were very successful. And so following the Second World War, as whiskey begins to boom, they were perfectly positioned to take advantage of that. What they were doing was selling contracts, bulk filling contracts to blenders, bottlers, what sort. So between 1954 and 1974, we went through a process of expansion to the point that in the 1970s, we were the largest malt distillery in the world. We had 23 stills. We could make 12.5 million litres of spirit every year. So it was absolutely crazy. Now, everything we were making at that time, the vast majority was going into blends, but Tomatin's actually been bottled as a single malt since 1927. It's one of the oldest single malt brands in the world, but the focus right up until probably the early 2000s was supplying the blended whiskey industry. Now, we went bankrupt again in 1984. It's crazy to think that we went from being the biggest, most efficient distiller in the world in 74 to bankrupt 10 years later, but it was all part of the wider economic downturn that collapsed the industry, and Tomatin was no safer than anyone else. However, in 1986, we were bought by a Japanese consortium led by a company called Takara Shutsu, and they bought the distillery. They were actually our biggest customer at the time, so they decided that rather than lose the supply of whiskey, they would buy the distillery, and that turned out to be a great thing for us because the way that they operate is very much a hands-off approach. We have full autonomy over the distillery. They don't own any other Scottish distilleries, so their interest is mostly in the shochu making industry, and they also have the rights to the Blanton's bourbon brand as well, which is a pretty cool little link in for us. But they very much leave us to do things ourselves. So we still have our head offices on site at the distillery. We've shifted our focus over the last 20 or so years away from quantity and into quality. And now, in terms of the whiskey that we're making, I truly believe it's some of the best liquid in the world, and it's consistently been backed up by awards that would suggest that as well.
Well, that was a really good history lesson.
Yeah, it was, bloody hell. That answered every question I was going to bring.
Yeah, don't worry, I've got more.
All but one. All but one.
Yeah.
One question I have got for you, out of interest. Am I right in thinking that Tomatin means the hill of juniper? Is that right?
Yeah.
So beyond that, my sort of mind verges towards gin.
Yeah.
Obviously being juniper, and so I just wondered whether there was ever any interest in gin as a category, and obviously being such a connection with the name.
I mean, there's plenty of interest in gin on a Thursday and a Friday night, but no, we've never made gin. We don't make gin, but the name's got more. There's more of a story there. So in Gaelic, the word Tom means hill. So you think of Tomatin, you think of Tom and Tool, Tam Navul, and Tam Du. It all begins with hill. But the Atin part, you're right, is the juniper, and that's what's unique to us. Like I say, we've never made gin, but the bush that the juniper berry grows on, the juniper branch, the wood, when you dry that and you light it on fire, it creates a very intense heat, but no visible smoke. So if you go back to the Monolith Mountains 200-300 years ago, where whiskey has been made illegally, the juniper bush provided the perfect fuel source for illicit distillers, because passing excise officers, they would normally look for two things. They would look for a supply of water, and they would look for plumes of smoke. So if you were able to heat your stills with a smokeless fuel, you were off to a winner, really. And so there's a real history of illicit production in the area. In fact, on the lands of the distillery, there's an old building that after the Battle of Culloden, a copper pot still was found there, and it was a guy that had been producing whiskey illegally, but then selling it to the government's pub at the bottom of the road. So lots of vagabonds and rogues in our history there.
I find it amazing that there's this distillery that probably a lot of people haven't heard of, and yet only 50 years ago was the biggest in the world, single malt distillery in the world, with 23 stills or whatever it is. And as you say, which I didn't know, was bottling single malt 100 years ago or more. And it's sort of, Glenfiddich takes a hell of a lot of, it gets got a lot of credit for, being big and for bottling single malt or marketing single malt first. And it's amazing that something as big and as important as that kind of slips by for a lot of people in whiskey.
Yeah, and I think that's partly what we're trying to change as well, right? When you look at the whiskey market globally, I think one thing I should correct is we're now a much smaller facility as well. We make about 1.8 million litres of alcohol, but now most of that is going to single malt. So, but I think, you look globally, you look at all the figures, and Tomatin's within the top 25 single malts globally, but where it differs from a lot of the other brands is that we have a spread across a lot of markets rather than maybe a big brand in the UK or a couple of other markets. But yeah, I think what we're trying to do now is really get the message that Tomatin has to share across, because I think when you think of whiskey and when you think of Highland single malt and what you want that to be, you're describing Tomatin. You're describing a community of people living and working on site, generations of the same family, acting as custodians of whiskies that their fathers produced and that their sons will go on to see being bottled. In this small pocket in the Highlands, everything's matured on site. The people that make the decisions are based there. I think it is Scotch whiskey as a whole. We know what matters there. But you're right. It's a brand that it's funny. I quite often hear people saying, it's an underrated whiskey. And I don't think that's true, because the people that do know about it rate it incredibly highly. And I think for the last 10 years, what we've been focused on as a brand has been building Tomatin within whiskey enthusiasts. But now we're taking that step to the wider whiskey drinking consumer, that more casual, that more enjoyable, that more journey of interest in whiskey. And I think that's where things like Whiskey Me are a great way of communicating with people that have maybe never heard of us before.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between underrated and under-recognized.
Yeah.
Underrated is people know it, but they don't. It's not necessarily rated as high as it should be. Under-recognized, can be a great dram, but perhaps just isn't drunk widely enough.
Yeah.
And Tomatin probably sits in the second one of those two categories. So let's talk a bit about the juice then. So you sort of say it's like, quintessential Scotch style. I think, isn't one of the sort of taglines of the distillery the lighter sides of the Highlands? Is that right?
Close. It's the softer side of the Highlands, yeah. So I think that's a good point to start with, because the whiskey that we're drinking tonight, the 12-year-old, for me, it's the classic Tomatin. When people tell me I want to try Tomatin, I always point them in that direction, which when someone comes up at you at Whiskey Festival and says, I want to try your 30-year-old, and I say, well, you have to try the 12-year-old first, gets quite a few sour looks. But it's the classic Tomatin, and I don't necessarily subscribe to the whiskey regions as a kind of roadmap for flavour nowadays. But what I will say is that the Tomatin 12-year-old really is the quintessential Highland single malt. Now, when you go beyond that, Tomatin prides itself on having one of the most diverse, varied, deep single malt ranges on the market. We go everything from legacy all the way up to a 50-year-old. We have one of the most expansive uses of different cask types from around the world. So there's a huge amount for people to enjoy. But for me, the 12-year-old, it's where it all began. It was first released about 25 years ago, and it really is that beautiful Highlander of a single malt.
Yeah.
Just one question, Scott, if you don't mind. Like, obviously, as a brand, having come from, say a brand, that's not the right word, as a liquid, having come from being predominantly or a lot in blends in the 70s through to being this kind of push-through brand in single malt recently, what's the sort of, there's something that goes behind that. What's the sort of vision for it as a single malt, really? Obviously the liquid's fantastic, but where do you see it sort of going from here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the one thing I'll always remember is when I started back at the distillery back in 2012, I had a conversation with the managing director at the time, a gentleman called Bob Anderson, and he very much summed it up saying the rest of the whiskey industry wanted it The rest of the whiskey industry saw how good it was. Now we want everyone else to see how good it is. And that was very much the thought behind it. And I think the spirit was originally designed to be a blendable single malt. It had to be versatile. And we've kept that, but we've dialed in on that. So we use the versatility to allow us to use a wider variety of casks in a lot of distilleries. But we ramp up things. We've got the longest fermentation in Scotland nowadays. So dialing in on the spirit itself. And the overall goal, I think we all saw where whiskey was going in the early 2000s. We wanted to build and establish Tomatin. The overall goal over the next 10 years is to be a top 20 single malt globally and top 10 within the UK. So the vision is firmly on single malt.
It's interesting for me because obviously if you think about a single malt whiskey that has been traditionally gone into blends over a long period of time, obviously being a key component of a blend is that it is versatile, right? In terms of flavor profile, it stretches across many boundaries. I think nowadays, what we try to do is break down the barriers around whiskey, and having a single malt whiskey that does that, i.e. it has such a versatile flavor profile, it fits perfectly with the current need of what people want, right? As in, if you're looking to get into single malt whiskey, you want something that is easy to get into, as an introductory whiskey, sweet, fragrant, and balanced.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think it's worth pointing out that unless your distillery was built in the last 20 years, you probably have been focused on supplying the blended whiskey industry for the length of your journey. Even the Glenfiddich and the Glenlivets of the world, the big brands, the vast majority of the whiskey that they would have ever sold would have gone into blended whiskey. But yeah, no, for us, absolutely, that versatility is key. I think what's really good about it is there's real depth there. The spirit is complex. It's got, I think when you look at the new make spirit, it's very fruity. It's got this lovely orchard fruit and rhubarb flavor. And then you go into that malty kind of cheesecake base backbone. That's something that Tomatin does really well, is maintains a real sense of the ingredient throughout the whole process, and that's there. And that comes through massively in the 12-year-old.
All right, everyone needs to stop saying nice things about it because I can't keep up with hosting all the. Fantastic! It's delicious. I tell you what, let's bring in someone else to see what their opinion is. So we're going to bring in Cristian Cuevas now from Cask, who are the importers of Mars Kasei, which is the wild whiskey we're going to taste tonight. But Cristian, I handed him myself in person a pouch of Tomatin 12 earlier, and I guess he's drinking it right now. Are you?
I am drinking it, yes. I got it here. Hello, everyone. Hi. I made sure that I poured the whole pouch.
Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah. Really
have you got any take on the Tomatin before we get on to talking about?
I'm actually quite familiar with them as well. It's I think when first tried there many years ago, it did make a really good impression on me. Flavor profile, texture. I thought it was absolutely great. Yeah. And I'd love to go and say hello every year when we work at the whiskey show. I always make sure that I go and say hello to the guys there.
Yeah. Well, it's quite funny because these two, I mean, we've never featured a Japanese whiskey on Whiskey Me before. So this is the first time, and that's Mars. But we've never featured even a Japanese or majority Japanese-owned distillery before, which is Tomatin. So the two whiskeys we've sent out this month both have a strong connection with Japan and with shochu as well, which is kind of interesting. And I think they're not a million miles from one another in style either, which maybe there's something to be said for that. There's an elegance there with them, I think, and a fruitiness and a fragrance. But we'll get into that a little bit more when we taste Mars in a minute. So, Cristian, do you perhaps want to give us a bit of an introduction into the Mars distillery and all that kind of thing, and maybe like, sure. I mean, we haven't got that long, but maybe sort of if you want to, like, just some sort of intel on Japanese whiskey as a whole as well, because it is the first time we've done it.
Well, I try to be as quick as I can, but I can tell you the Hombo, or the company that owns Mars is still family owned. They started in 1972. They started distilling shochu in 1909, and they share the godfather of Japanese whiskey with some of the other brands. For Masataka Taketsuru was the starting point for some of the other whiskey brands. But everyone tends to forget or never ask the question, who sent Masataka Taketsuru to Scotland to learn the art of making whiskey? And it was a gentleman called Kihiro Ayawai, who eventually went to be an advisor at Hombo Mars and got the first whiskey license in 1949. Mars,
for anyone that's not aware, Masataka Taketsuru, who Cristian mentioned, was sort of important in the formation of both the Suntory whiskey brand and Nikka, more importantly Nikka. So between the kind of 2 or 3 individuals, they more or less completely established Japanese whiskey as a whole. And like you say, important part of the Mars Hombo origin story as well. Yeah.
Yes, and so when he went back to Japan, he handed the notes. So the Chinchu distillery are the only whiskey distillery where the actual stills are built to Masataka Taketsuru's specification, to the notes that he handed over. They moved the stills in 1995 to the Chinchu distillery, which is in the Alps, the highest distillery in Japan. Unfortunately, they closed, they stopped production in 1992 and then restarted the stills in 2011. In 2014, they refurbished the stills. Actually, they built them again, but to the exact specifications. They kept very true to the to the work that had been done before. And in 2016, they handed the notebook back to Taketsuru's family as a gesture of goodwill. Yes,
that's cool. That's lovely.
So really interesting. They have their own water source from the Otagiri River. They have a well that's 120 meters where they draw the water. The production is about 200,000 liters a year at the moment. And the Chinchu distillery produces a light style of whiskey. Just because of its location, the minus temperatures can go down to minus 15 and in summer up to 33 degrees.
Yeah. So 200,000 litres a year, Scott, you might well know, that would place it, if it was in Scotland, like amongst the bottom 2 or 3 in terms of production volume, right? It's tiny.
Yes.
It's virtually nothing, really.
Yeah.
It's around about the same size as some of the newer distilleries, isn't it?
The new, exactly. Certainly none of the more established ones are producing anything like that small a volume. So it's very small indeed. So Kasei is a blended whiskey, right? So
it's a blended whiskey, yes.
Yeah. So grain and malt. And
you got grain and malt.
Yeah. And so, I mean, with whiskey like this, I mean, whenever I sort of taste sort of a lot of Japanese whiskeys, I'm always like, what's the purpose of this? And so much of the time, like, I feel like, oh, wow, this is going to excel on a highball, dilute with a bit of water. I think a lot of the, especially younger non-age statement expressions from Japan, like they're almost, you're not really buying a finished product. You're buying something that's designed to have water mixed with it, or perhaps soda water, or like served over shaved ice or something on there.
One of the questions that I actually had, the third question I had was, how would you recommend drinking it? What would you recommend as the, assuming that you weren't going to drink it neat, how would you recommend drinking it, bring out its best potential, really?
I recommend it with a nice bit of ice, to be honest with you. It was sort of created to go hand in hand with Japanese food. Very light and delicate with a little bit of a hint of smoke. So obviously when you're having sushi or any kind of Japanese food, it's not too sort of intrusive on the palate, I would say. Great on a highball for summer. I think is it works really well.
In terms of a highball, Cristian, obviously from my perspective, a highball pretty much can be mixed almost with anything, right? It could be ginger ale, ginger beer, it could be Coca-Cola, soda water, whatever. Is there anything that you'd sort of, what's your preference really in terms of what would you mix it with? Would it be just still water, soda water, Coca-Cola, ginger ale?
My favorite is ginger ale. That for me is on my but soda water works really well. And in a
miso ale, I'm going to enjoy one of those in a moment when we're done.
Yeah, you do, please.
Maybe I can do ginger ale now.
Definitely,
ginger ale
right now.
Yeah. But what do you think, Scott? You're tasting it. You've got some there, haven't you?
Yeah, I've got a little taste of it here. It's lovely stuff, isn't it? I saw on the card there, very floral. I got that as soon as I opened the pouch, but there's like a nice sort of underlying cinnamon spice and maybe a little bit like a poached pear. I often get desserts with the first nose of a whiskey, and I'm getting that here. It's absolutely delicious. I think, as the guys were saying, it's a great kind of foot in the door to Japanese whiskey and all that it offers. I think it was Dave Broom I once heard saying that where Scotch whiskey is maybe like turbulent water, Japanese whiskey is like a crystal clear lake, and I think that's the comparison we've got between the two whiskies tonight.
Yeah,
definitely agree.
No, it's a great way of describing it, isn't it? And I mean, on the pouch, I think we put what did we put? Honey, white flowers, and something else. Grapes.
White grapes.
Yeah. And that for me sort of kind of gets it. You know, there is certainly a honeyed note to me. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? I often mistakenly don't relate honey and flowers together, and then it occurs to me, wait a second, honey's made from flowers, so it's no wonder they have a connection to one another. But like for me, that you get both in this whiskey, and I do think for that reason it's a good inroad into Japanese, because one of the things that oh, thank you very much. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
It's one of the benefits of recording this from a bar.
One of the things that I find about Japanese whiskey, and you know, it's often difficult to sort of set Japanese whiskey apart from Scotch, sometimes because it is Scotch, but you know, but for true Japanese whiskey, there is a certain kind of incense or fragrance to it that I find that is unusual in other whiskies, and I think that this Mars is you know, an inexpensive but an accessible inroad into that sort of flavor identity, and then you can kind of go up from there. Do you think that's right, Cristian?
Yeah, no, definitely. It's a really great introduction, especially, you know, with the age statements of Japanese whiskey at the moment. I mean, it's a little bit, you know, difficult to introduce people, you know, and new whiskey drinkers as well. You know, it's something nice to show them.
Yeah, well, Mars is one of the few distilleries that it is still reasonably easy to get hold of. I mean, tell me, are you able to still get the kind of allocation of stock in the UK? Are there certain SKUs or expressions that are tricky to get hold of now, or is everything still pretty much available?
Well, do you know what? It doesn't help that they do a lot of single casks in Japan.
Yeah.
That's the main focus, and we wish we could get some access to those, but we get a lot of the single malts limited editions coming through the year. I mean, when I say a lot, I mean 60 bottles. So it's not huge.
Just one question, Cristian, or to both of you really, because obviously both are kind of connected. In terms of the background around shochu, is there any fundamental kind of practices or ethos from shochu, given that the companies that I guess have taken on this whiskey brands that follow through? You know, any production techniques or anything that follow through?
Also, either of you can answer first, but what if perhaps one of you could just explain very briefly what shochu actually is?
Yeah, true.
As I understand, it's a distillate made from sweet potato. Mars makes it twice a year. So when they started making whiskey, they obviously, when they were not making shochu, they started making whiskey in between until they went actually full time onto on the whiskey production. So now they have two separate teams. They have a team that only makes whiskey, which is a very young team. The average age is about 35, and that goes across the distillers, blenders, and then obviously the shochu side is it's a completely different side.
Yeah.
Shochu is really quite incredible. So I was fortunate enough with one of our other brands, Kuboken, we actually released the first Scotch whiskey to be matured in shochu casks. And so I was able to do some tastings with the whiskey and the shochu. And even the history of it is very similar to Scotch whiskey. You know, it was first discovered around about the same time in the kind of late 1400s, early 1500s. And it's similar to Scotch. It can be made in pot stills or column stills. They've got koji in the fermentation there, which is it's a science into itself, separate from yeast. But yeah, like
sweet potato, isn't it?
Yeah, the sweet potatoes is a big one, but I believe they can use really any form of starch. You can actually get barley shochu, which I guess is not a million miles from a whiskey style spirit, but it's an incredible thing.
Yeah, rice is used as well, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Kabukin, we may or may not be featuring at some point.
Oh yeah.
We may. I mean, not no spoiler out there, but it's possible that we might be. We'll see.
That will be another very good night.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. Cool. Well, look, one thing I will tell you is that the Mars Kasei with ginger ale is
Delicious.
freaking delicious. It's so good. Yes.
I think the thing around that is, we always talk about we always question and talk about how whiskey should be consumed, right? And I think the reality is that there is no real definitive answer on how it should be. It's like, how do you enjoy it? Even with single malt whiskies, which, carry this sort of stigma around, but it should only be consumed neat. But actually, mixing it with ginger ale or soda or with ice or whatever it might be, really it's how you enjoy it, isn't it? I think, which is the key thing about opening up the category to people.
Is there any particular serves that you promote with Tomatin 12, Scott? Besides,
yeah, I mean, so with Tomatin, our kind of whole ethos is enjoy it the way you like it. In the same way that if you ask for a coffee and you ask for milk, no one's allowed to tell you not to have milk. So enjoy your Tomatin the way you do. For me, my favorite way of enjoying a Tomatin 12 is with a little beer beside it. Not so much a cocktail in and of itself, but a wee half and half. Like I say, it's a very traditional Scotch whiskey. So the traditional way of drinking a Scotch whiskey.
Which beer is it?
I've got tonight a Cromarty Brewing Arctic Swell. So it's a Vienna lager, which is working magic with it.
Yeah. No, a beer and a whiskey together is absolutely great. Beer and a bump, half and half.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's perfect. Or a Boilermaker, in fact.
Yeah.
That's an American. It's got to be American whiskey, though, isn't it?
Whatever you want to call it, always equals fun, right? which is the most important thing, I think, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Just one last question, Cristian. Like, in terms of, not a technical one, but obviously Japanese whiskey, right, is quite stifled by the availability. What do you see as being the sort of, how do you see it over the next 12 months or so in terms of what's going to happen and availability and how, given that there's so much limited availability of stocks, who's going to sort of push forward and give people what they want? Because there's clearly a demand.
Yeah, was obviously we encounter that problem a lot. We are quite lucky that Mars as a company has opened a new distillery. They actually opened in 2016, which is Tsunuki Distillery in Kagoshima. And their idea is to experiment with the different type of climates for the aging. So you got the Chinchu Distillery in the Alps. You go the Tsunuki Distillery in Kagoshima, which is the most southern point. And then they have an aging warehouse in Yakushima Island, which is a UNESCO heritage site. And they're allowed to age up to 350 barrels there. That obviously, hopefully, will increase a lot the whiskey production. Obviously, double it, hopefully, by next year or the one after. So hopefully, they will, we'll see more of it.
Yeah, amazing.
The demand will always keep growing. But hopefully we'll get a lot more access.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because both Japan and Scotland have seen slumps. Scotland more than one, and it's devastating to the industry when it happens. I mean, it's happened in a big way. Twice in Scotland, I guess. Like once in the early 19th century, and once in the early 20th century, and once in the late 20th century. And you see just these mass closures followed, but predictably by mass openings. And we're in the mass opening bit right now. And then, we're due another slump in probably 20 or 30 years. Do you have any reason, Scott, to believe that history won't repeat itself?
Yeah, like I say, I'm a student history and always looking at those things. But I think the big difference between now and particularly the 1980s crash is that the whiskey industry is in contact with the consumer. So the 1980s lull, of course, there was the economic thing, but the real reason for the 1980s drop off was that people moved towards white spirits, gin and vodka in particular. And in Japan, you know, our parent company Takara, they were at the forefront of the shochu boom in Japan, which moved people away from Japanese whiskey, and that's why you saw a lot of closures there. I think the real difference is that in the past we were still producing massive amounts of whiskey because we thought the demand was still there. There were no visitor centres in the 1980s. There were no brand ambassadors. You know, there was no online. And I think what you're seeing today is that in the past, where whiskey was popular for a while, and then gin and vodka, everything's popular now. It's kind of like the rising tide is lifting all ships. Now, I don't know if the levels of boom that we're going through can last forever, but I don't think there will be the same massive lulls as there were twice in the past anyway. I certainly hope not, because I've got at least 30 more years of doing this whiskey thing before. So if we can last that long.
I think the big problem is projecting whiskey volumes, right? I mean, it's impossible. It's an almost impossible task to project what whiskey will be selling at any given point, even in 3 years' time, let alone 10 years, 20 years' time.
Yeah,
up and down.
But I think, as Scott correctly recognised, there is a difference now in the past, in like the 70s and in the early 20th century. Whiskey was a business-to-business operation, right? You would be a producer and you'd sell to a blender, and the blender would sell to the end consumer. Whereas, although obviously blending is still a huge part of the Scotch whisky industry and a huge part of whiskey globally, there is so much of a stronger connection to the end consumer now, and not all, but the vast majority of whiskey distilleries now are selling direct to consumer, now have a visitor centre, now have at least one distillery release, or they have a blend attached to the distillery, which is sort of part and parcel of that operation, even if they don't have their own malt bottling. So it's a different climate, isn't it? And I think that probably that stronger relationship with end consumer means that they can be that little bit more reactive to market demands.
Yeah, I would say I think a big thing for us is there's much more of a feel that we're far more in control of our own destiny than we were during previous lulls, because in the past it was dictated on the business practices of other businesses, whereas now we are able to react directly to consumer demands. And like you say, forecasting stock is always going to be a bit of a gazing into a crystal ball while you're juggling plates. It's always going to be a little bit of what if, and nobody would have seen COVID happening, and that's had an impact on sales and production and whatnot. But I think being able to react much quicker is the big difference between now and the past.
Great, cool. Well, there's a couple of extra comments actually. I definitely missed some questions along the way because I've been too busy talking. So apologies for that. But this comment here I thought was great. Whiskey should just be drunken company with happy chat, like tonight. That's what it's all about. Sharing the knowledge in a fun and friendly way.
100%.
I love that.
Excellent.
Well, cool. Look, Scott, Cristian, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us tonight. It's been a lot of fun and really great tasting your whiskies. I was going to say your liquids, but that sounds pretty so look, thanks a lot, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
And we will see you next time.
Cheers.